Welcome back to Beyond the Kitchen Table, a space where we have conversations that don't always happen while we're cooking, but absolutely should. And we're back having our conversation around Alzheimer's disease. So if you've watched prior episodes, I've talked about my mother's diagnosis. I've talked about the signs and symptoms we saw. I've talked about the emotional roller coaster, the guilt I felt, the grief I felt, everything that comes along with loving a parent that has Alzheimer's disease. But today's episode, we're talking about the coins. We're talking about the financial part of loving a parent that has Alzheimer's disease. So in today's episode, we'll be talking about home health care. We'll be talking about nursing home care. We'll also be talking about Medicaid and the entire look back period, as well as long-term care insurance. My mother had long-term care insurance, and we'll talk about that, what it meant, how it helped, how it failed. And then we'll also talk about Medicaid. My mother didn't qualify for Medicaid. I'll talk about why, and I'll also talk about the look back period and why that's important for you to know about now than later. Once again, I want to put out a disclaimer. I am not an expert when it comes to any of these topics. I'm just sharing my personal experience in regards to what we went through, just so my experience can hopefully help you. As you're going through this journey, you can think ahead in regards to what I experienced, and maybe you can avoid some of the things that I went through. Okay, let's start with home health care, right? That is when you have someone come in, a home health care aide come in and help take care of your loved one. And they can do various tasks. It really depends on, what your loved one needs at the time. Remember, Alzheimer's disease is a very long disease, right? If you go back and look at my earlier episodes, I talk about how my mother had her short-term memory was compromised, right? So once she got to that point where she was starting to wander, she couldn't cook on her own. Those were the times when we needed to have somebody come in. So we had a home health care aide come in pretty early on. Mind you, my father was 83 when he passed away. So my father was her main caregiver. My father was diagnosed with cancer in June of 2014, right? So after he got surgery or had surgery in late summer of 2014, he needed a home health care aide. So it basically was a great time to introduce a home health care aide because of the fact that he needed help and my mother needed help. And I think she recognized that, right? And she was actually more accepting to the fact that somebody that they didn't know was coming into the home and helping prepare meals and cleaning up and doing tasks that they were not able to do. So that's how it started for us, because my father needed care and recovering from his surgery for colon cancer, and my mother was home with Alzheimer's disease. Now, we went through a home health care agency. I can't recall the name at the time. Both my parents had long-term care insurance, and we'll talk about that and how it was helpful until it wasn't. We'll discuss that later in the episode. So we went through a lot of different people, because when you have someone you don't know come into your home, that is off-putting, right? I lived here in Maryland and my parents lived in North Carolina. I had two family members that did live in the same town as my parents, but everybody had families and other things, so they couldn't live with my parents in order to take care of them. So we had home health care aides that came in and took care of them. So we had some excellent ones. And I just told you a story about ones that didn't work out so well. We had people that were stealing from my mother and father. We had people that were not doing what they were supposed to do as far as like taking care of them. I shared a story about catching somebody sleep. The cost of that care, though, was expensive. My parents had long-term care insurance, so their care was covered. We brought initially folks into the home before my father really went into his surgery during the day. But once he got out of surgery, then we had to start bringing people in 24 hours a day. And they work by the hour. So when you have people staying overnight to make sure your loved one doesn't get up at 2 in the morning and get out the house and walk to the ball field, like how my mother wanted to do one night, that's very expensive. I don't know if anybody that's watching this video has children, but I remember when my daughter was in daycare and then preschool, pretty much times that twice when it comes to care for a loved one. Mind you, my mother was needing home care aides around 2013, 14, 15. We in 2026, baby. I don't know what the cost is now, but at that time, it was very expensive. So you have to think about the things that they help with. They help with bathing, dressing, meals, medication reminders, supervising your loved one, especially if they have Alzheimer's. You have to, make sure that person is not doing things to harm themselves. The cost of that care is very expensive. You really have to think about where you're going to get the money for that, right? Most of our parents are on a budget when they get older. So I really wish this country would do more about helping folks that are taking care of their parents figure out a different way in regards to providing care, because it is very, very expensive. And I know somebody's watching this and is going to be like, well, why didn't you just take care of your mother at home? I talked about this. I had a baby. I had a 3-month-old baby. By the time my mother needed around-the-clock care and was not able to get out of the bed, my daughter was 3 months old. She had a pulmonary embolism, and I talk about that in the last episode. My mother had a pulmonary embolism when Maya was 3 months old. Plus, I lived out of the state. So it was very difficult for me to be able to move. Plus, at the time, my husband, my bonus daughters would come into our home every other weekend. It just was not a viable solution for us to pick up and move to Kinston, North Carolina to take care of my mom, or to bring her to Maryland, right? So, that also goes into the guilt. You want it to happen. You want to take care of your parent, but, because of all of these other, things that's happening in your life, it's not possible. Plus, you have to work. Just like when you have a child, you have to put them in some type of daycare or preschool. It really is the same thing with an adult parent. It's impossible to take care of a parent that has Alzheimer's disease and work, especially if they're aggressive or in those certain stages of this disease, incapable of taking care of them. And it gets to that point. You have to really kind of figure out, depending on what you have going on in your life, when you may have to make the decision to have them go into a nursing home. So let's talk about that. The decision to put my mother in a nursing home and how much that cost. I briefly talked about why we decided to put my mother into a nursing home. Like I said, after she had the pulmonary embolism, 3 months after my father died, we brought her back home. About a year, she was at home with a 24-hour care, with 24-hour nurses coming to take care of her. Like I said, we had issues with that. But once she experienced another episode where she ended up in the hospital again, and to me, it was a neglect on the aides part. I felt like it was time for her to be in a facility where she could get 24-hour care. There were nurses and aides coming into her room. She needed elevated care. And at that point, she had been in the bed and been bedridden for over a year. So once she had that pulmonary embolism, she no longer was able to really have a conversation. She needed to be changed. She needed to be fed. She needed full-time care. So we toured a couple of different facilities in and near our hometown, and decided to place her in a facility that was outside of our hometown, just because my mother was well known in the community. We kind of wanted to put her outside of the hometown, just because we didn't want people just popping up, to come see her. We wanted a little bit of distance between where she lived and where she was. Especially since she didn't have her wits about her. So that's what we decided on. It was a nice facility. You have to keep in mind, depending on the stage that your loved one is in, my mother needed 24-hour care. She needed help with feeding, changing, all of those types of things. So she needed nursing home care. If you have a parent who is still able to walk and talk, but their short-term memory is compromised, you may want to consider memory care or assisted living, right? They're able to do some things for themselves, but they still need to be cared for and watched over. So there are different types of facilities. assisted living and memory care are two different types of facilities that you can look into, but it depends on your loved one's stage, and it also depends on what, you know, the type of level of care they needed. For us, my mother went from home healthcare aides to a nursing home because she got really sick in 2015. The thing about my mother is she was a planner. She planned for there to be something in place to take care of her if she got sick. I mentioned that my parents owned a funeral home, but they also were insurance agents. They sold life insurance and they sold long-term care insurance as well. So my mother and father did have long-term care. So long-term care paid for the home health care aides and then paid for the nursing home until it didn't. So let's talk about that debacle. Long-term care, when my parents got it in the 90s versus long-term care now. Honestly, I don't even feel like it's worth, I'm not an expert, I'm not an insurance agent, but the policy and plans that they had was really good and extensive, but it still, at the end of the day, it ran out because the insurance company went bankrupt. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about long-term care insurance when it helps until it doesn't, okay? So long-term care, let me explain what that is. It's just like having any type of insurance, right? It's you pay into a policy, and once you need this type of care, then they cover, you know, your benefits kick in based on doctor's notes and things like that, that you need this care. So like I said, she had it for while she was at home and then into the nursing home. We get a letter maybe it was like a year or a year and a half into her being in the nursing home, that Penn Treaty, and this is public information, you can Google it. You can Google how Penn Treaty did their customers so dirty. Penn Treaty is a company out of Pennsylvania, and they sent their customers a letter. Basically, her as her family, we got the letter because my mother wasn't at the time, you know, capable of reading a letter and determining what it meant. That said, basically, we ran out of money. We sold too many policies for X amount of dollars, and this is all we got. So this is the amount of money you have, and once it runs out, it's out. Mind you, my mother had a lifelong benefit, which meant she paid a higher premium for long-term care insurance, so it took care of her as long as she was on this earth. And baby, that did not happen. This company went completely bankrupt. And I want to say by the time I was notified about that letter, she didn't have many months left. And we'll talk about kind of how that came about. Mind you, I did not live in North Carolina. I was not there. I was not opening her mail. I was living in Maryland. So some things I was not privy to. But that takes a lot of scrambling when you got to figure out how you're going to come up with $7,700 a month. Because that's how much my mother's nursing home was for her to stay every month. $7,700 to $8,000 a month. So what do you do in that situation, right? We had to pay out of pocket. We didn't have any other choice because there's something called a look back period, which made my mother not be able to qualify for Medicaid. When you have assets, my mother was a business owner. She owned property. She owned real estate. She had wealth, right? So the government is going to look and see, well, what she got? Because she's not going to get Medicaid if she got a house or a rental home or land that she can sell and help take care of her in this nursing home. We're not going to help her. She's not going to qualify for Medicaid. So they're going to look back 5 years. So by the time we were alerted that the long-term care insurance company was going belly up, we had no choice but to pay out of pocket. She was not going to qualify for Medicaid. That would have meant we would have had to sell everything that was attached to her name and wait 5 years in order for her to qualify for Medicaid, which just didn't make sense. So we had to pay out of pocket. And that was very tough. I mentioned the Medicaid and the look back period just because a lot of people don't know that, right? If you have someone in your life, a parent especially, that has Alzheimer's or showing signs of Alzheimer's today, if you're watching this video today, you need to consult with an elder care attorney. because you need to look at their finances and their assets and determine how you're going to care for them as this disease progresses. You have to plan for something like this. I just told you how much it costs in 2016 all the way to 2021 to take care of my mother. And we're talking about rural North Carolina. If you're living in a city, it's a cool 10 grand plus. I have a friend whose dad was in nursing home care in New York, and his care was 10,000 plus. So it really depends on where you live. And you have to put your loved one in a place that's safe, right? Because nobody wants to put their loved one in a place that's not safe. They're not getting the care and the attention that they need, and that costs money. Nursing home facility my mother was in washed her clothes, they fed her, they changed her, they would take her into like the community room so she could be around other people. But like I said, she did not speak for the last pretty much 5 years of her life. So, and she was in a room by herself. She didn't have a roommate. It was just, her in the room. But it was a challenge because we had to figure out how we gonna pay this $7,700 a month every month. And, once we realized like Medicaid was not an option because, she had assets, it became very much of a challenge. So I definitely suggest you speak to an elder care attorney. You really talk to your loved one, or maybe the spouse of your loved one, to figure out what do they have, what assets are there to help take care of them, because the cost is expensive. Some people have to sell their childhood homes. They have to sell off assets to pay for the care. Regardless of, having your parent come home to live with you, that's still a cost. If you're watching this video and you have a loved one who has early Alzheimer's disease, you really need to start having a conversation with not an estate planning attorney, but a elder planning attorney expert, and figure out what your options are. I know these are conversations no one wants to have, but they're the ones that really matter. And that's why I'm, starting the conversation in this series, because I've been through it. I didn't know what I didn't know going through loving a parent that has Alzheimer's disease. My mother had things in place, and she still things went left, right? And she had some things in place like long-term care insurance. But, in this economy and how things are going, even back then, 2016, 2017, the company went belly up because people are living longer, and Alzheimer's is affecting so many different people, and the care is astronomical. So for this company to go out of business and basically leave my mother high and dry when she paid into a lifelong benefit, that was something that she wasn't expecting. But she did her part and she planned accordingly. I have planned for what was to come. So I hope this episode was helpful. Please share this video with anybody you know who is taking care of someone who has Alzheimer's disease. Come back for the next episode, because we're going to talk about the legal part. We're going to talk about power of attorney. We're going to talk about guardianship. We're going to talk about, all of the things that comes along with if you have to sit in and be responsible for that person's well-being and finances, right? That's something we also went through. So come back for next week's episode where we'll talk about that. Thank you for joining me beyond the kitchen table, and I'll see you soon.